So as some of you might have noticed, I've been talking more and more about the end of the World War II consensus, about, let's say, the mythology of World War II and how it founds our world. I've talked about it on several podcasts. If you haven't followed with Benjamin Boyce, with Winston Marshall, with Ali Tabrizi, and I've also been talking about it on my own newsletter. So if you want to hear more about my ideas on that, you can look at in all these directions. One of the reasons why I don't want to make all these videos on my channel, because I don't want to make my channel about that. I think it's important to talk about, but I actually talk about this stuff rather reluctantly because I don't like talking about politics. I'd rather talk about religion and culture, and as we say, politics is downstream from that. But now, because of everything that's going on, it's important to talk about some of the issues. And so I wanted to bring up just two images. The image of even the structure of World War II as the Axis and the Allies, and show that already in the way that we understand the division of the war, the main division of the war, we already have the structure of the World War II consensus in there.
This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
So for those who have been following, we are about to launch our new Rapunzel book very soon. We were so excited to get this into people's hands that we actually airshipped about 1,000 copies, and some people were able to access those 1,000 copies. We sold, I think it was 900 copies we had on sale. We sold 900 copies in like 26 hours, and so I'm really excited to see how people reading it and getting the first glimpses. We already have some reviews coming in. It was also a way for us to test our new shipping service and our new distribution service, and we couldn't believe it. People were getting their books. Some got it on the same day that they ordered it. Other people's got them 1 day, 2 days later, and so we're really happy to see this new distribution system work out. And so we decided that the book is going to be launching explicitly in about a month, but we decided to still do a pre-order for those who are interested, because I recorded an audiobook version of the Rapunzel book, and we also put together a kind of worksheet to go through the story with your kids, with your family. So we thought we could offer that to those who were willing to pre-order the book. Those that already bought the very first 1,000 copies were able to get it, and so we wanted to extend that offer to those who wanted to pre-order. And so go to rapunzelbook.com and get your book. I cannot wait for people to read this, because this is where the story gets interesting. This is where the threads are going to start to come together and where the characters are going to start to repeat. So get in on Tales from Once and Ever. This is the third book. We still got a whole bunch coming. We've got 3 books that are in production right now. Excited. This is the thing that gets me the most excited, is this fairy tale project. So thanks everybody, and go get your book. One of the things that I've talked about for many times over and over is that in some ways the modern world is a radicalization of the question of the one and the many. In some ways, this division, I call it the separation of heaven and earth, where things move more and more towards a kind of radical unity, and a kind of tyranny and control, which can be represented, of course, as the bureaucratic state itself, as the nation state with solid borders, as the move towards more and more centralized identities, whether it is ethnic identities that happen, of course, in the modern age as well. And on the other side, which is more and more of a kind of chaotic sense, with the increase, of course, chaotic in the sense of moving towards multiplicity, or the power of multiplicity, and in that sense you have democracies in there, but you also have the revolutionary narrative in itself, this idea that the many kind of come up and take over or defeat the one, because the one is dangerous and tyrannical. And then on the other hand, you have this sense that we need more and more state control and more unification, first at the state level and now at the kind of world level. And those two narratives kind of play off each other, this movement towards one and this movement towards the many. as a type of deincarnation. What you can see is that already in the structure of World War II, with the imagery of the Axis and the Allies, it's already there, and it is already a reflection of what's going to happen. And in some ways, the World War II consensus, because of who won the war, ended up setting up the structure for the next generation of what it is that we tend to prioritize. We can start with the Axis. Of course, if you look at the symbolism of the axis, an axis is a pole, right? An axis is a vertical thing, or a vertical around which things turn. It is in some ways the one itself, and this is the imagery that was used. And if you look at the imagery, the kind of iconography of the axis, you see this focus on uniformity. If you think of the regimes, this image of the uniform, the Nazi uniform, these huge squares of people walking, like this image of the power of unity, the power of one. And of course, the swastika is itself an image of the axis. The symbolist René Guénon at the beginning of the 20th century suggested that the swastika was in fact the Polaris star, and what we call the Little Dipper, that is turning around that Polaris star. And so if you think about, it's like a point with a crook. And some of older swastikas, right, they have a double crook that's similar to the Little Dipper, the little bear, and so whether or not that's actually what the swastika is about, that imagery of the swastika as being a polar image would have been known by the people who developed it in Germany. Whether it's polar, whether it's solar as well, whether it is this idea of it's like in some ways a kind of solar wheel, all of these images are images of centrality and of origin and of unity very, very strongly. And so it is quite normal that the axis looks the way it does. In the Italians have the fasces, this idea of this bundle that is tied together really strongly and represents the unity of the enterprise, and how if we're bound into one, then that unity is much stronger than the multiplicity, right? If you bind multiplicity together strongly, then it becomes extremely strong. And of course, the same with the sun in Japan, right? So the sun, the solar imagery in Japan, and the axial and solar imagery in the swastika, the fasces in Italy, all of these images go together in terms of these images of unity. And that's why there's such an emphasis on national unity, on racial unity, on hierarchy, extreme hierarchy. All of this type of imagery is there in the fascist imagery. And now on the other side, what you have are the Allies. And so in the way that the Allies ended up coming together, it's interesting, because if things had gone differently, like if the alliance between Hitler and Stalin would have held, in some ways, we would have had a kind of authoritarian versus more democratic regime, and that would have been the narrative structure, right? So you have authoritarianism, and then you have this kind of, you could say, democratic idea. But because the Allies ended up allying themselves with the communists, with the Russians, what ends up happening is you really have more of the one and the many. And so now the revolutionary trope is the one that gets emphasized, you could say, narratively, where it is possible to ally ourselves with communists because we are both in some ways anti-hierarchy, right? Anti-hierarchy in the sense of origin and this kind of the type of imperial original imagery. And so all of this goes together. And so if you look at the imagery of the Allies, they don't have a kind of centralization. It's represented in some ways as really a loose alliance or a loose federation, which is what the United Nations end up becoming. This idea of a federation of nations, right? So when you use the word federation, what you're suggesting in some ways the power of the many, the power of a kind of willful alliance, one that's not dependent on a higher origin or on something higher that's binding us together. And there's a kind of flexibility in that. There's a looseness to that strength, and there's also a tendency to emphasize the individual, especially in terms of Western Europe and the United States. And so the image becomes a kind of ragtag, the ragtag army, right? This idea of an army of difference becomes the type of imagery that's used. And if you think about it, all of our narrative since World War II, most of our narratives have been about that, which is a loose ragtag group that defeats a unitary principle, right? That defeats something that is too tyrannical, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's even recently in the recent Marvel series, Captain America has his Howling Wolves, which were like a bunch of different people from different nations. Like each person in his battalion represented a different nation, and they're kind of all very, very different. But their difference and the strength of their difference is what makes them flexible and have all these different qualities that are able to join together rather loosely in order to defeat this tyrannical, authoritarian structure. And so this is, of course, the story that we've been facing ever since World War II, which is that's the narrative. The narrative is ragtag multiplicity against the tyranny of the one. But of course, that is not the full story, right? You could tell another story, which is in some ways that the ragtag group becomes chaotic, becomes subversive, to its own means, and that you need some kind of authority, Return of the King style, in order to reestablish a form of order. Those two stories are legitimate because excess can come from both sides. But we've been pushing this story very, very strongly, and this is something that this is going to be tough for some people to swallow. But the Rainbow Coalition stuff is downstream from the Star Wars narrative. It's downstream from the idea of the rebellion, of this loose alliance of all these different groups of planets and all these different extraterrestrial races that are all facing this kind of all dark clad, let's say European stock fascist imagery of the empire, right? And so, when the kind of woke people said, and even in Marvel and all of these movies, they said in some ways that they're completely being coherent with stories that already been there, like the new Star Wars movies. They were a continuation of something, of an imagery that was already there, the original Star Wars movies, which was this ragtag alliance of diversity against unity. Now, the thing is that sometimes needs to happen. That sometimes is, you could say, it's a normal narrative if it has a kind of reasonability to it. And like I've said, the emphasis on federation and the emphasis on an equality of multiple people has been the strength of the world since the end of World War II, and it has worked and it has held us together. But if you keep pushing in that direction, at some point you reach its fringes and you reach its excesses, and then you reach a kind of inverted storytelling, right? The idea where unity is bad, where identity is bad, where the only possible identities are revolutionary identities. It's upside down stories. It's women ruling over men. It's minorities ruling over those that hold the nation or hold the name of the nation. It's the idea of migrants or immigrants being more important, being more powerful, being more having more value than those that were there in the first place. And so, like, you can see how if you push the story, which is a completely legitimate story, you end up with a kind of excess which no longer holds. And then that excess, what it does is it calls to the other side. And this is what I've been warning you about, is that in some ways it calls to the other side. It calls for a form of unity. It looks to go back to, and then all the memes about the Empire was right in Star Wars, and that there's a lot of these kinds of memes that's been appearing maybe since 2015, 2016, about how, in fact, maybe the other side was right. And the truth is that we don't need to go all the way to that direction, but we do need to be aware that we're reaching the end of one story, like the push towards the image of loose federations fighting, let's say, fighting unity is no longer plausible, because we're looking at our world fall apart and we're seeing things crumble, and we need to be able to reformulate unity. The danger is that the way the unity will be reformulated might be tyrannical either way that we go, right? Whether we go left or right, the unity might be tyrannical, whether it's a kind of fascistic type nationalist identity or whether it is a globalist, technocracy. All of these can lead towards forms of tyranny. What we really need is to find the balance again and to reformulate unity and multiplicity at every single level, at the local level, at the family level, at the city level, at the national level, so that we can avoid these movements towards extreme unity and extreme multiplicity. But what I wanted mostly for you to be able to see is to what extent that imagery is already there. It was already there right at the outset. And if you look at the way that, let's say, you could say the way that the GIs are represented versus the way that we tend to think of the Nazi officer, right? The SS with their black uniforms, and their kind of very, very tight look, and the GIs, kind of loose, everything kind of falling apart with all the stuff on them. They look more like a kind of chaotic adventure, and there's something seductive about that for sure. But you can see that the entire aesthetic of the Axis versus the Allies, if you meditate on it, you'll see that the fact that the Allies won then established which narratives were permissible and which narratives were encouraged until today. And they also are showing to what extent they've run out. And so hopefully we can find solutions that aren't excessive. So what's interesting when you look at the way that the Axis and the Allies represent themselves is you can see that we have in some ways a perfect storm of symbolism, which is, and this is in some ways where the story becomes the most powerful. That is when, if you have two opponents, those two opponents actually recognize themselves to be something. And so the Axis recognizes itself to be the strength of unity, the strength of the one. And the Allies, in some ways, recognize themselves as being this federation, loose federation of people that are joining together voluntarily in order to fight something. And so you have this perfect storm, because on the one hand, what you can do with the propaganda of the war is you can emphasize the negative aspect of the other side. And so what ends up happening is, of course, the Allies represent the Axis as being tyrannical, as being monolithic, as being an excess of the one. And that, of course, ramps up. Now, the Axis was already something like that. But what happens is that the propaganda effort, the pressure of the narrative, ramps up the stakes and makes the way that you represent the enemy even more and more of what they are in the negative sense. And the same for the other side. Of course, the Axis propaganda would emphasize the Allies as being degenerate, as being subversive, as being chaotic, as being mixed, right? That was also an important aspect of the, as being confused in the sense of mixed. And so now, all of a sudden, they've emphasized not the strength of a kind of loose federation of people, but rather the negative aspect of that loose configuration. And that's when you really have let's say, a perfect storm. And the propaganda effort and the narrative pressure is also what created, in some ways, the World War II myth, or the post-World War II consensus is that propaganda, let's say, led to a story that became necessary for winning the war, and a story that then became necessary for holding things together after the war had ended. And so it's not that the propaganda isn't based on images that were true. Like I said, the Axis and the Allies recognized themselves as being either images of the one or images of the many, but it is rather you could say it is the desire to defeat the other that creates the type of pressure that makes the other side into an absolute evil that has to be destroyed. And then that narrative pressure continues after the war has won. And that can help you understand why in some ways it's kind of like a narrative virus that keeps taking up more and more space. And that's why in some ways the imagery of unity after World War II just keeps getting pushed and pushed and pushed until even normal images of unity like family or like nation or like heritage, all of these different things, unless it's revolutionary, becomes an image of fascism. That is, of course, untenable, and that is one of the reasons why the pendulum is tending or wants to swing back, hopefully not completely to the other side, but is definitely swinging back as we speak. And so I hope this was insightful and that this brought you to think further on the question of where we are and what's going on. And thank you for your support of the Symbolic World. If you can, please sign up to the symbolicworld.com. You have all kinds of advantages signing up, and it also is a possibility of supporting us financially as well. And so thanks everyone for your attention, and I'll talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.